A little bit about life in the Chesapeake. And much like a lot of America in the colonial period, especially the further inland you went, the further west, American life was pretty tough. Life was nasty, brutish, and short for a lot of the earliest Chesapeake settlers. Now, what colonies are we talking about when we're talking about the Chesapeake Bay area? What two main colonies are on the Chesapeake? Any guesses? You guys don't know where the Chesapeake Bay is? It's not New England. It's a good guess. Virginia and Maryland. Those are the two Chesapeake Bay colonies. Now, you don't really associate Virginia and Maryland with these, things like malaria and dysentery and typhoid today. However, those things were rampant amongst the earliest settlers in the Chesapeake. In fact, just the very nature of the geography of the Chesapeake made your life expectancy significantly shorter if that's where you chose to go. Half of the people born in Virginia and Maryland did not survive to age 20. Half. And that is in large part due to the diseases that ravaged those early colonies. So, did the population grow there? What do you think? Did the population of these colonies grow despite these hardships and these diseases? Yes, very good. So, it makes you sound better on the video if you know the answers. Okay? So, yes, it did. So how? Now that's the $1 million question. How? If with half the people aren't even living to childbearing age, basically, how is the population of this area growing? Fresh immigration from the old world, particularly from England, where the majority of immigrants to the Chesapeake were single men in their late teens and early 20s, most of whom died soon after their arrival. This isn't far from where you live, guys. Life was hard. The males that did survive had to compete for the affections of extremely scarce women, whom they outnumbered nearly 6-1. As a result of scarce women, high mortality rate, families were very few and fragile. It was, most marriages were destroyed by death in 1 to 3 years. So needless to say, weak family ties changed the dynamic of what marriage looked like in the Chesapeake. You see a lot of unmarried young girls having babies just because of the nature of, they're not going to really live long enough. So you see morality decline slightly. I mean, you're surrounded by death. So also a high rate of men and a low rate of women are going to lead to that kind of thing. Yet despite these hardships, both Virginia and Maryland, they struggled on. They continue to struggle on. And the native-born inhabitants eventually acquire what? When was the last time you guys worried about catching malaria or smallpox or something like that? Because why? You're immune. And just as you're immune, these people born amongst all this disgusting filth and virus and bacteria and nastiness, they acquire immunity too. Due to that, the presence of more women allow for more families to form, And by the end of the 1600s, after about a century of being there, the white population of the Chesapeake was growing on the basis of its own birth rate. Now, let me ask you this question. It was really crappy there. It was bad. I mean, bad. And yet people were still flocking there to the point where the population was growing. Why? Why? Why go there? You know you're probably going to die within a year. Why risk it? What's the draw? What are people doing there? What's the entire economy of the Chesapeake based on? This is not a good sign. Tobacco. Everywhere, as far as the eye could see, in the 1600s in the Chesapeake, tobacco was being grown. Although unhealthy for human life, the Chesapeake was an extremely hospitable environment for tobacco cultivation. And profit-hungry settlers planted tobacco often even before they planted corn. They'd rather have something to sell than something to eat. And because they needed so much land for doing it, they continually were sprawling westward, away from the ocean and inland. And with more and more people showing up, and the population getting greater and greater, and more people needing land to cultivate tobacco, what is going to be inevitably what happens? Fighting with who? Native Americans. Is going to be a natural thing. It has to happen. Indian attacks were very common. And as more and more tobacco began being grown, pretty soon they're going to grow more than the demand calls for. What does that cause if there's too much of a given product? Inflation. So when they've grown, when they've oversatisfied the demand for tobacco, what happens to the price of tobacco? It goes down. If these tobacco farmers were wise, what would be the smart thing to do? Stop growing tobacco. They were not wise. What did they do? Grow even more. Which does what to the prices? It goes in the tank, the toilet. It bottoms out. So the enormous production of tobacco caused depressed prices. And the colonial Chesapeake tobacco growers, they responded by doing the thing they shouldn't have done, planting even more tobacco. So in doing this, though, in order to continue to grow tobacco, they needed to have more labor because you can only do so much work. And families in the Chesapeake, how were they forming in the 1600s? Anybody? Were they forming in the 1600s? What did we just say about like 6-to-1 men to women? They were not forming very well. So that because you're not having little farmers to come help you on your own farm with your children, you still have to have labor. And so since families were forming too slowly to provide it through natural population increase, trying to capture Native Americans, that's not going to work. And because not only because contact with them will kill them too quickly, but they're not a very reliable source of labor. African slaves cost way too much money. So what's the next possible option for these Chesapeake farmers to get some labor? Indentured servants. England still had a surplus of displaced people, poor white folks, who were desperate for employment. And so many of them indentured themselves. An indenture is just a contract. You're a contracted slave. That's what an indentured servant is. You're a slave of the contract as opposed to just a regular slave. So, indentured servants would contract their bodies and their labor for several years. In exchange for what? What do you get in return? If you're going to come work for somebody for several years, what do you get in return? Any guesses? At the end of your indenture, some of them would offer you some land. What else? Well, where are these indentured servants coming from? How do you get from England to the Chesapeake? On a boat. A couple days. Takes several weeks on a dangerous sea voyage. Is that cheap? Who's going to pay for that passage across the ocean? That's right. The person who's already there with the land. And so the person who owns the land will pay for your passage across the ocean. While you're working for them, they will provide you with food, a place to sleep, shelter, clothing. And usually your indenture was for about 7 years. Most indentures were for 7 years. However, some of them could have been 2 or 3. They varied, but the majority were for 7 years. And at the end of your 7 years, you did what was called your freedom dues. You paid your freedom dues. And many of these Chesapeake farmers would give their indentured servants clothes, tools, maybe even a small parcel of land for them to call their own. Not a bad deal if you were just a poor person living in a gutter in England. Now you're a landowner, and all you had to do is cross the ocean and survive for 7 years and work pretty hard. Now, were all indentures great? Were some farmers greedy and just like at the end of your 7 years, maybe slip a little poison to you so they didn't have to give anything? Maybe there are collected stories of that, but for the most part, people were upstanding people and held true to their contracts. Okay, so what this system is called, it's called the headright system. Both Virginia and Maryland use the headright system, which is a system that's what to get people from England to the Chesapeake to work as an indentured servant. That's the headright system, okay? So basically it's just whoever paid for the passage across the ocean was given an incentive. So not only the person who's buying the indentured servant, not only are they getting an indentured servant, but the government in England would be like, to make you want to have more indentured servants, for every one that you pay for, we're going to give you 50 acres of land. So to incentivize people that are already here, to encourage more people to come, they were going to give them land. All right? That's the headright system. So why would England give away 50 acres of land per person? Well, what does England get out of that? What are they losing in return? What kind of people? The what people? Okay. In England, what is English losing? They're just shipping off all their poor people. They don't have to care for them. They don't have to look at them. They're shipping them off. And so America is literally built with the poorest people from the old world. People who are looking for an opportunity, especially in the Chesapeake. Because the Chesapeake at the beginning did not utilize a lot of African slaves. Why? It was too expensive for them. And so the Chesapeake planters, they relied on indentured servants. And indentured servants, don't think it was an easy life. Everybody lived a hard life. But unlike slaves, they had one thing different: hope. They had hope. They had something to look forward to at the end, whereas slaves had no hope whatsoever. Indentured servants had hope. They looked forward to becoming free and acquiring land of their own after they complete their few years of servitude. But they were treated very similar to slaves. If they misbehaved or did things that were, harmed the land or the master, they could have time added to their terms of service, and that's all counted in, all part of their indenture. All right, all part of their indenture. Okay. So questions on how the headright system works in indentured servitude. Look at that dude. He's suave, isn't he? That is Nathaniel Bacon on the right. The Chesapeake, and the Virginia colony in particular, was accumulating a large group of footloose men like Nathaniel Bacon, who were impoverished and were drifting discontently throughout the Chesapeake. Most of these were single men who came over as indentured servants, completed their indentured servitude, and then the guy, their master said, "See you later," and didn't give them any land, didn't give them anything. And so basically these are homeless people who are just drifting around. Their hopes being broken, no hope of acquiring land, no hope of starting a family, because these men outnumber the women 6-1, so they can't even do that. So these guys are pretty upset, pretty wretched bachelors. And they look around and they see all these established planters, especially the further east you go, these big farms and plantations in places like Jamestown and Williamsburg, and wealthy people. And so where do these guys have to go in order to get anything, to have land, to have, where do they got to go? Where do they have to go to find land? What direction? West, because everything on the East Coast has been settled and planted and used up by now. So they have to literally travel into the wilderness. Well, who lives there? Native Americans. Do you think that these footloose guys who are desperate are willing to try to kill some Indians in order to have some land? Yes. So, that being said, there begins to emerge a large divide between these poor white settlers in the West and the wealthy landed aristocrats in the East. The governor of Virginia, whose name was William Berkeley. You ever heard of Berkeley? As in Berkeley County, West Virginia? Well, Berkeley was the governor of Virginia in the 1670s. And he created some friendly policies toward Native Americans. Why would he do that? If you're the governor of Virginia in the 1670s, why would he create friendly policies toward Native Americans? Where is the capital of Virginia, where William Berkeley lives? It's where they established their first colony. Capital of the Virginia colony. Starts with a J. Jamestown. Geographically, where is Jamestown located? What part of Virginia? Is it inland? No, it's where? On the coast. pretty far away from being inland. It's on the beach, guys. So, that being said, what kind of Native American problems do you think they have in Jamestown? None. The Native Americans have long been extinct in that area due to disease and battling. Remember, we talked about some of the fighting that took place. So when he creates these friendly friendly policies toward Native Americans, how do the people in the western part of the colony, who are literally fighting hand to hand with Native Americans daily over land, how do you think they feel about these wealthy rich people who don't have to live in the scratch by in the dirt, making friendly policies toward Native Americans? How would they feel? Not good. Thank you. So they resented people like Nathaniel Bacon, these footloose farmers living in the West, scratching by. They resented that policy made by William Berkeley toward the Indians. So they let it be known. They say, hey, Governor Berkeley, we don't appreciate this. And we want you to help us. We are citizens. Help us with getting rid of these Native Americans so that we can have some land of our own. And when Berkeley refused to do that, they resented him. Well, they retaliate. What do you think they did? They did, without a doubt. And the first start of their rebellion is to go from Indian home to Indian home and killing every man, woman, and child and setting the villages on fire on frontier settlements. So they fell murderously upon Indians. And then, once they did that, they turned their attention to Jamestown. And Nathaniel Bacon and a lot of his farmer friends marched to Jamestown, chased William Berkeley out of the capital, and set Jamestown on fire and burned it to the ground. Now who's in charge of the colony? These murderers, not William Berkeley. Needless to say, chaos swept throughout the colony as frustrated freemen and resentful servants went on a rampage of pilfering and plundering. Just stealing, like a riot. Who's going to stop them? Nobody's there to stop them. So this is like a civil war in Virginia. And as the Civil War ground on, of course, Nathaniel Bacon suddenly dies of disease. And the rebellion is stopped. Berkeley regains power and control as governor, and with pretty brutal cruelty, crushes the uprising and hangs about 20 of the rebels publicly. I'll give somebody extra credit if they can tell me the implications for the future of the Virginia and Maryland colonies because of this rebellion. What major changes occur as a result?
Strict rules on slaves and indentured servants. And slaves, not indentured servants.
I'll give you half extra credit.
Okay.
the nature of labor changes. Who's causing all these problems? Who are these guys causing problems? Former indentured servants. So what do we need to get rid of? We need to get rid of indentured servants. Still need labor? What kind of labor are we going to use now? Slaves. African slaves. The nature of labor changes in the Chesapeake as a result of these troublemaking former indentured servants. So the large plantation owners are still looking for labor, but they don't want to have a lot of the trouble, looking for less troublesome laborers to toil in the restless tobacco kingdom. So their eyes fell to Africa and African slaves. So that brings a pretty drastic change to the dynamic of the demographics of the colonies, especially in the Chesapeake. Okay? Colonial slavery, it's as horrible as you can imagine. Most of the slaves who reached North America came from the west coast of Africa, including the area from present-day Senegal to Angola. A lot of them were originally captured by African coastal tribes literally African tribal people would war with other African tribal people, and they would capture prisoners, and the prisoners would be sold to white people as slaves. That's how a lot of it happened. Okay, a lot of it, not all, but a lot. So then these people, these humans, were then shipped off to American flesh merchants, who were then bound up, chained, branded, like an animal, heat up metal, and then burn it into their skin like a cow, and sent to on auction blocks and auctioned off. If they had families, the families were separated. About the most horrible thing you could imagine. But first, you have to get there, and the voyage itself was horrific. It's gruesome journey across the ocean, with death rates as high as 20%. So you had a 1 in 5 chance of dying some horrible disease. If you did survive, you were shoved on the auction blocks and treated like an animal. People putting their fingers in your mouth, looking at your teeth, inspecting your body. Much like an animal. And this was such a popular and lucrative business for many people. African slavery became an extremely large economic trade in the South, particularly places like South Carolina, where slaves outnumbered white people, almost 2 to 1. And you would think, with being outnumbered, that they would rebel. Well, remember we talked about those slave codes that existed? Those formal statutes to make African slaves and their children property. And they have no rights, they have no voice, they have no say. Many colonies did things like making it a crime to teach slaves literacy, teach them to read or write. But, slavery may have began in America for economic reasons, but by the end of the 17th century, it was clear that it was racial discrimination. And racial discrimination was a large part of the slave system. America is really the only, a lot of other places have had slavery. The Romans had slavery, the Greeks had slavery, the Egyptians. And really, America is the only place where race and slavery has been tied together. You could be anybody and be a slave in Rome. It all depended upon if you were captured in battle or if you owed somebody money or whatever. had nothing to do with the color of your skin. It is in America where race and condition of servitude were linked together as a result of, even though it began for economic reasons, racial discrimination became a major part of the slave system. And their lives were terrible, as you may imagine. Especially the deeper in the south you go, where the conditions are like, how hot it gets here in the summer times, right? I want you to imagine like Alabama in the dead of August with like 1,000% humidity and 105 degrees. Misery, absolute misery. So slave life was especially harsh. The climate was hostile to health. They worked from daylight to dark. Usually in the South, particularly in South Carolina, you're working on a rice or an indigo plantation. The larger the plantation you were on, probably the worse conditions were. Whereas if you were a slave to a person who had one or two slaves, they were more than likely working in the field with you, alongside with you, perhaps even sharing a meal with you with their families. Needless to say, you're still a slave and not allowed to leave or do anything without permission. But, as opposed to being on a plantation with 400 slaves and, you're mistreated, the treatment's a little bit different. I'm not saying it's good to be a slave regardless of what, it's bad no matter what. But as far as the Chesapeake goes, the captive African population in the Chesapeake area began to grow not only through new slavery imports, but through its own birth rate. So this is, in America, America has one of the very few slave societies that grew by natural means. In almost every other society where slavery was held, they just worked the slaves to death. But slaves in America were investments. You didn't want them to die quickly. You wanted them to have enough food where they could survive, and because of that, they were able to form a culture of their own. A lot of African words, as a result of this, have passed into American vernacular, American language. Like, you ever heard of voodoo? Voodoo, it's an African word. Or goober. You know what a goober is? Not like SpongeBob goober. Peanut. You ever eaten? What's the peanut butter and jelly stuff mixed together? Goober. Gumbo. You ever heard of that? All right, these come from Angola. Come from slaves that came from Angola. In fact, they called them gulas. Angola. So West African religious dance has come into American society. Even evolved into different forms of music today, like jazz. All of these they've come from African culture. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So you guys have any questions? Okay, I'll stop there for the day. If you guys have any questions that pop up, just let me know.